Vivian gave to me. But this one is better. Do you know what happened to Bowie?
I don't know. Maybe she's late.
Of course, I think my recorder is still in her car. That's why I don't have it.
Oh, I see.
Of course, we went to the computer shop yesterday, and I think I forgot to take my bag out from her car. The recorder is in her car, in the bag. Okay, so begin with the homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Okay, good morning, everyone. Okay, good. Okay, so we've been reading Sutta number 111. This is the Anupada Sutta, which is translated by Venerable Nyanamoli as one by one as they occur. Okay, and this sutta is describing the experience, the meditative experience of Venerable Sariputta, the sequential process by which he achieved arahantship. And if you remember, according to the Buddha's or the account that I gave last week, after Venerable Sariputta entered the Buddhist order, it took him 2 weeks of practice to achieve arahantship. He was already predicted by the Buddha to become one of the 2 chief disciples of the Buddha. And along with his friend Moggallana, they were ordained together. And Moggallana achieved arahantship after 1 week of meditation. But Sariputta had to investigate and explore many more phenomena in order to become the chief disciple in wisdom. So that's why it took him a longer time, all of 2 weeks, to reach the final goal. And so according to this sutta, Sariputta's approach to enlightenment was to enter each of the meditative attainments, of samadhi or samatha, the 4 jhanas, and then the 4 formless meditations, and to investigate and to explore those meditative states, first analytically, by dissecting them into their constituent mental factors, and then to explore them, we might say, dynamically in terms of their arising and passing away. And so last week we took the first state attained and experienced by Sariputta. That is the first jhana. And then this passage says that, or it ends by saying that after entering that state, contemplating it, becoming detached from it, Sariputta saw that there is what's called, the text calls this, an escape beyond. And then it says with the cultivation of that, he confirmed that there is. And in this case, the escape beyond the first jhana is the second jhana. Okay, so now we can come back to the text, and we're taking with section 5. So the Buddha is explaining how Sariputta developed his meditation. So the text says, "Again, bhikkhus, with the stilling of applied and sustained thought, Sariputta entered and abided in the second jhana, which has self-confidence," that's the translation here, "and singleness of mind, without applied and sustained thought, with rapture and pleasure born of concentration." So this is the classical or the standard formula for the second jhana. And what's distinctive of the second jhana as compared with the first is that two factors present in the first jhana vanish with the attainment of the second jhana. And what are those two factors? They're what are called in Pali vitakka and vichara, which is translated here as applied thought and sustained thought. Excuse me?
Are you taking questions now or at the end you take questions?
At points within the exposition, I'll ask for questions, and then at the end. But first, let me just go through and... Okay, so in the first jhana, we have vitakka, which is said to have the function of directing the mind onto the object, or sometimes it's explained a little more sort of metaphorically as lifting the mind and placing it onto the object. Then vichara has the function of, sometimes it's said, of rubbing the object or exploring the object, examining the object. Piti here is translated rapture, or you could render it as joy, elation, uplifting of the mind. And sukha is pleasure. It's the pleasant feeling. And then there is one pointedness, which is the fixing of the mind on the object, or the unification of the mind on the object. So those are the actual factors of the first jhana. Now, to progress from the first jhana to the second jhana, it's said that what the meditator has to do is after emerging from the first jhana, well, first he has to master the first jhana, to get it high degree of control over the first jhana, so that he could attain it whenever he wants, remain in it as long as he wants, and emerge from it whenever he wants, right on the spot. So after gaining a certain degree of facility in the first jhana, then the meditator coming out will look into that jhana and see that there's still some degree of imperfection or disturbance in the first jhana. And what is causing that disturbance in the first jhana? Not somebody else's cell phone with a musical theme. But within the jhana itself, there is vitakka and vichara, which are relatively coarse mental factors. And so he sees that those factors are rather coarse, and since he's acquainted with the Buddha's teaching, or even if outside the Buddha's teaching, even the non-Buddhist meditative systems have this gradation of stages of concentration, they see that there is a more peaceful, more excellent state beyond this, in which this activity of thought, investigation, examination have subsided, a state in which the mind becomes much more quiet, much more peaceful than in the first jhana. So it's like the first jhana is a little bit like the lake. Maybe on a day like today, or maybe it's a little too cold, but no, I think you could see that the lake on the whole is very still. You just look out the window. But there's still a little very subtle pattern of wavelets over the surface of the lake. And so those little wavelets is like the activity of vitakka and vichara. And so if we really wanted to have a lake that's perfectly flat, just like a mirror, then that little bit of breeze would have to stop. And then all of those little wavelets disappear, and the lake becomes perfectly smooth. So that is like the subsiding of vitakka and vichara going into the second jhana. And so it said at the beginning of the description, with the stilling, upassama, quieting down or subsiding of applied and sustained thought, Sariputta entered and abided in the second jhana, which has, here I don't actually like the rendering self-confidence. Self-confidence, that's what my mother would always say to me when I was like in high school, you need more self-confidence. Don't be so shy. Don't be backwards. Get up there and sell yourself. But the Pali is ajatang, which means, could be taken as within oneself. Ajatang ceto sampasadanang. And another implication of the word sampasadanang is not confidence, but a serenity, or now in my latest translation I use placidity, becoming very peaceful. Placidity, sampasadana, or if placidity is a little bookish, serenity, tranquility. So it's like a further tranquilization, internal tranquilization. And then singleness of mind This brings to prominence the factor of one-pointedness, which is now being brought in. And then we have without applied and sustained thought. And now it says rapture and pleasure born of concentration, born of samadhi. If you go back and look at the formula for the first jhana, you see that it says that it's accompanied by rapture and pleasure born of seclusion. Vivekajang piti sukham. This is because in the first jhana, the mind becomes secluded or separated from unwholesome states, unwholesome mental qualities. And so as the mind becomes separated or secluded from the unwholesome mental qualities, then there arise this pure joy and pleasure, which are said to be born of that seclusion, born of the separation from the disturbing or unwholesome mental factors. But now, in moving from the first jhana to the second jhana, the degree of concentration or samadhi becomes stronger. And so now it's said that the rapture and pleasure are born of concentration. So even though rapture and pleasure are present both in the first jhana and the second jhana, but there's a difference in quality between them. In the first jhana, because there's the connection with applied and sustained thought, still the rapture and pleasure are a little bit coarse. But in the second jhana, they become more refined, more purified. Okay, before we go on, did you have a question?
Well, I just was thinking that in the mental practice and the concentration practice, that would be just directing the mind when you say the phrases. And
Yeah, I think we usually like to have you use the microphone so the question will get recorded.
This is the mic. Oh, okay. Hold this. Hold it. That's all right. Okay.
Oh, yeah, okay.
No, my question was in relation to metta as a concentration practice.
Yeah.
So it would be with the phrases would be, sorry. The phrases would be directing the mind on the phrases. Would that be vitakka?
That would actually be, in that process, the activity of vitakka would be prominent. Yeah. Yeah, but even in, say, a more simpler meditative practice, say mindfulness and breathing, where you don't use full phrases, but the task is just to keep the mind on the breath, then vitakka would be that factor which is sort of lifting up the mind and putting it on the sensation of the breath coming in and out. Or if one is using a verbal formula, like when you're breathing in, it would be vitakka, which is formulating, verbalizing in. And when breathing out, it would be vitakka, which is verbalizing out. But even when the meditation becomes very, very subtle, even in the first jhana, there's no discursive verbalization like that. But there's still this very subtle activity of directing the mind onto the object. And that is said to be the work of vitakka. And then the way I see vichara, or what I sustained thought, or I use now examination, it's what is sort of looking at the object, not examining it from the standpoint of insight, not looking deeply into it to see its characteristics, but just sort of looking at the object. Okay, so now Sariputta enters the second jhana, And now the Buddha is going to explain how Sariputta did this special contemplation of the second jhana. So it says that the states in the second jhana, the self-confidence, or I would say internal tranquility, the rapture, the pleasure, the unification of mind. Okay, so those are the factors that are mentioned in the formula itself. Then we have additional factors: the contact, feeling, perception, volition, and mind. This, I think, as I mentioned last time, this forms a set of factors which is sometimes called the group with contact as the fifth, because we have here 5 factors which are present in every state of consciousness. Every state of consciousness involves contact, that is, the mind contacting the object. There's some feeling. In this case, it's a pleasant feeling. There's perception. There is volition or chaitana. And of course, there is citta, which is the mind. And then we have a bundle of other factors. Here, the next one is translated zeal. Again, I don't quite like this, because the word zeal, when somebody gets really enthusiastic, like when the Jehovah's Witnesses come at the door and say, "Can I introduce you to our organization?" That's zeal. But when people get all worked up, you see maybe at the presidential conventions, USA, USA, USA. That's zeal. But this is, in Pali, it's chanda, which is, I translate this as desire. And it's desire not in the negative sense of craving, but in order to achieve anything, one needs some desire to achieve it. So this is the desire to realize one's goal, the desire to achieve one's objective. So there is that desire, there is decision, or maybe better in this case, resolve, resolution, since one had to make that resolution on reaching the jhana. So there is that zeal, resolution, energy, of course there has to be that effort, that mental power, mindfulness, equanimity, and attention. And what's interesting to note here, and I think we came across this even in the formula for the first jhana, even though in the standard jhana formulas, mindfulness and equanimity are explicitly mentioned only when we come to the third jhana, but in the enumeration of factors that we see here in the second jhana, mindfulness and equanimity are already present. And in fact, mindfulness and equanimity are present even in the stages preliminary to the jhana. As one is practicing the meditation, one is, in order to keep the mind on the object, one needs mindfulness. So mindfulness is a key factor for the attainment of the jhana itself. And then as one is practicing meditation towards the jhana, one is gradually developing equanimity, which here doesn't mean, it's not equanimity in the sense of neutral feeling, but it's equanimity in the sense of balance of mind. Or sometimes it's called the neutral state of mind, or keeping the mind right there in the middle. For example, when we're sitting in meditation, as time goes by, after could be 30 minutes, 40 minutes, we start to get some pain in the legs. And so normally, if you're just sitting at your desk without any mindfulness, you may be sitting, reading a book, you get a little uncomfortable in one posture, and even without thinking about it, you just shift to another posture, and you're not even aware that you've shifted. But what's taken place is that there was some, very subtle aversion towards the old posture, the painful posture, and then a deliberate effort to change the posture. But when you're sitting in meditation, when the pain starts to come up, instead of, reacting against it, you tell yourself, endure it, don't pay any attention to it, just go back to the meditation object. And so the pain is coming up, but you're not being, disturbed by it. And so in this way, you're starting to get equanimity, keeping the mind in the middle, not disturbed, in this case, by bodily pain. And sometimes, maybe as you're sitting, some pleasant memory will come up, or maybe some special pleasant feelings will start to come up as the mind settles down. The mind will become bright, clear, feeling of joy will start to arise. But again, when that arises, if you're practicing properly, then you tell yourself, don't indulge in it, don't become attached to it, just note it and let it go. And so with this, again, you're keeping the mind in the middle. And so already, even in this preliminary stage, way below the jhana, but one is building up this equanimity as keeping the mind in the middle, keeping the mind balanced, not being repelled by any painful feelings, painful bodily feelings, or it could be, as you're sitting in meditation, painful memories come up, or feelings of aversion towards people that come into your mind. But again, you just have to, dismiss those thoughts, dismiss those feelings, and keep the mind in the middle, keep the mind in balance. So keeping the mind in balance, not repelled by pain, not attracted to pleasant thoughts, pleasant feelings. One is moving towards this balance that becomes more prominent in the jhanic states. Okay, so we have this mindfulness, equanimity, and then in every state of consciousness we have attention. And so Sariputta looked into the jhana, in this case the second jhana, and saw how the jhana is maybe we call it a constellation, or a conjunction, or assemblage, amalgamation of this diversity of mental factors. And so this is, in a sense, setting the stage for wisdom, because wisdom, from one angle, is the ability to examine one's experience and see it in terms of physical factors, bodily factors, and mental factors. And here, since the jhanic state is predominantly a mental experience, he's seeing the jhana as this assemblage of mental factors. And so one function of this analytical investigation of the jhana is, how would we express this? Maybe we could say it's a deconstruction of the sense of self. Because what happens with many of the meditative systems, the non-Buddhist meditative systems, where they have a practice of concentration, contemplative prayer, or simple mindfulness exercises, where the mind can enter, through these practices, the mind can enter into a state of samadhi, deep concentration. But without that analytical framework, the meditator will grasp upon that experience as the revelation of the true self, the realization of the true self, the real I, the indestructible, permanent, universal, all-embracing Atman. That's the absolute self. But with the Buddhist framework, one looks into that mental state and sees how this deep meditative state of concentration is an assemblage of distinct mental factors. And each one will be able to sort of conceptually isolate or distinguish, maybe distinguish is better than isolate, to distinguish it conceptually, see its distinctive flavor or characteristic, see its function which within this total experience. And so this is a little bit like maybe, in physics, back in the late 19th century, early 20th century, as they were doing investigations into the constitution of matter, finally the scientists, maybe anybody who has a better background in the history of physics could correct me. Is it Rutherford? Rutherford, who came up with the atomic theory, who sort of isolated the atoms and said, now we've done it, we found the fundamental constituents of matter. Matter is made of atoms. And I think the Greek derivation of atom is, the word atom is prefix a plus tam, has something to do with division. So the atom means that which is indivisible, that which can't be divided. But then come from the early 20th century, late 19th century, early 20th century, a decade or two later, what do they do with the atom? They investigate further. Yeah? Yeah. Then they discover the atom is not indivisible after all, but it's made up of subatomic particles. I remember when I was a boy, we used to read about protons, electrons, neutrons. That's it. Those are the fundamentals. But then as scientists went on investigating further, what they find out that the neutron is actually a combination of several particles. And then they discover a whole, somebody called it the zoo of subatomic particles. A whole variety of subatomic particles. And then now I think they've reduced those to quarks. And I think now they're saying everything is constituted by a combination of 4 or 6 types of quarks. But I will bet, the hair on my head that in 20, 30 years from now, they'll be finding that the quarks are made up of snarks. And the snarks are made up of snark. Excuse me? Oh, I think string theory is passé, so 1990s. Okay, so anyway, so by analyzing an apparent whole into its constituents, we sort of break up or pull away the foundation for the ascription of the quality of selfhood, substantial selfhood, to this experience. Okay, but to correct or to balance the analytical aspect of the teaching, we also have the aspect of conditionality, which shows that we don't only analyze phenomena into constituents, but we also see how these constituents are all tied together into a vast net of conditional relations, so that they're all sort of, in a sense, all unified within this network of conditionality. Okay, but now Sariputta, after breaking the jhanic experience down into these factors, now he's going to contemplate with insight, to explore with insight. So the Buddha says that these states were defined by him one by one as they occurred. Then the Buddha says, known to him, those dhammas, those factors arose, known they were present, known they disappeared. So now Sariputta is turning from an analytical investigation of the jhana to an examination of the jhana in terms of, we call this the insight into impermanence, the contemplation of impermanence. And here, impermanence isn't to be taken just, in the very broad, general sense that everything comes to an end, that we all have to grow old and die. But this is what we might call, we might call that the macroscopic concept of impermanence. But this is the microscopic insight into impermanence, the insight that even at the level of moment-by-moment experience, things are arising, standing just for a moment, then passing away. And so Sariputta is saying how even the jhana is constituted by an ever-changing flow of mental factors, factors which are arising, standing, passing away, arising, standing, passing away. And so then he understood, here to get the full text we go back to section 4, he understood thus, so indeed these states, not having been, come into being, and having been, they vanish. This might seem rather trivial when you just read it in print, but when one experiences it with insight, it's really quite, let's say, almost a startling or mind-opening experience. Because when one is examining one's experience with insight, when the mindfulness and the contemplation become very clear and precise, one sees how at any moment the whole bundle of factors of experience is coming into being and then just in a split second vanishing. So like, for example, when we're walking back and forth, doing the walking meditation, in the grosser stages, it seems like I'm walking back and forth. Here I'm taking the right step, left step, right step, left step. And so it seems like there's a persisting subject there, which is taking one step after another step, one step after another step. But when the mind, when one really builds up very strong momentum of contemplation, then even in lifting up, say, the right foot, in that one act of lifting up the right foot, one is seeing like dozens of times, even in that one act of lifting the foot, one sees that the physical process that make up the foot, almost at the molecular level, are arising and passing, arising and passing. And the mind that's aware of lifting up the foot is also undergoing constant succession of thoughts of arising, 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 till one comes to the fully lifted foot, then bringing the foot forward. One sees, even in that one act of bringing the foot forward, that the physical components of the foot are arising and passing, arising and passing, and the mind that is aware of that is also arising and passing, arising and passing. And then when putting the foot down, again the same thing. So before raising the foot is not raised. In raising the foot is in the act of being raised. When one stops raising the foot, then the act of raising is finished. So there is already an insight into impermanence. When bringing the foot forward, before one brings the foot forward, the movement of the foot forward has not occurred. As one is bringing the foot forward, it's occurring. When one stops bringing the foot forward, the forward movement has stopped. Then in bringing the foot down, before bringing the foot down, the downward movement has not occurred. When bringing the foot down, the downward movement is occurring. When the foot is fully down, the downward movement has stopped. So this is impermanence just in one step: raising, bringing forward, putting down. Even at the coarser level, 3 steps. Before lifting, it's not there. When lifting, it's occurring. Then it stops. Bringing forward, putting down, the same thing. And so, as the mindfulness becomes ever stronger, one starts to see into this coming into being and passing out of being at subtler and subtler levels. And so indeed, these states not having been, come into being, having been, they vanish. Then regarding these states, he abided, unattracted, unrepelled. This shows the absence of craving and aversion, independent, detached, free, dissociated, with a mind rid of barriers. And then he understood there is an escape beyond, and with the cultivation of that attainment, he confirmed that there is an escape beyond. Okay, any questions on this presentation so far? Yeah, please.
How do you differentiate mindfulness and attention?
Okay, that's a good question. Okay, the question is, how does one differentiate mindfulness from attention? Okay, the way attention is explained, attention is that particular mental function which turns the mind to an object. We see it most clearly in the case when maybe one's attention is turned to one thing, and then suppose from this direction somebody is in the stacks of the books and there's a sound of a dropping, and our mind turns to that. What caused that dropping sound? Or what caused that collision sound? And so here we're turning the mind to that object. That brings out the function of attention most clearly. But attention is present, it's said, in every act of consciousness. Of course, in every act of consciousness, there has to be the turning of the mind to the object. Now, the way I understand mindfulness would be that factor which is responsible for keeping the object in mind and not letting the mind drift away from its object. So whereas attention can be a purely like spontaneous, just natural function of the mind, mindfulness involves some degree of deliberate effort, the deliberate effort to keep the object in mind and to prevent the mind from slipping away from the object, or to prevent the object from slipping out of view of the mind.
So intention is like a grosser form, and then the mindfulness comes in.
I would say that, yeah.
And then, could you give an example of volition in this state?
Volition would be the will or intention of keeping the mind on the object. But one thing I have to say about these mental factors is that, the distinctions between them are often very subtle. So it's said to show what the Buddha accomplished by analyzing experience into these different factors. A work called The Questions of King Milinda Panna gives this simile of the chef in a kitchen who is preparing a soup, and he puts into the soup like black pepper, oregano, basil, cumin. What are some other things one puts into the soup? Okay, let's say just that's enough. Cumin, coriander, turmeric. Excuse me? Oregano. I said oregano. I said yeah. So he puts all of these spices in, and then when he serves the soup, if you can, taste the soup and then you distinguish, that aspect of the flavor is what's coming from the oregano, that's what's coming from the black pepper, that's what's coming from the coriander, that's from the turmeric, that's from the cumin powder. It takes a really super sharp tongue to distinguish the contributions of the different spices. Okay, let's move on. Okay.
So back to her first question, the mindfulness would be yanasino manasikara?
No, mindfulness is sati. Mindfulness is sati. Attention is manasikara.
And appropriate attention is yanasino?
Yoniso manasikara, but my opinion is that yoniso manasikara is a more complex phenomena. We translate it, or it's often translated wise attention or careful attention, but here I think manasikara involves like more reflection, consideration, contemplation. So it's a more complex than this manasikara, which is the simple bare act of attention. Okay, let us move on now to the third jhana. Okay, so Sariputta, he's with the cultivation of this attainment, he confirms that there is an escape beyond this, and the escape beyond this is the third jhana. And so now to move from the second jhana to the third jhana, what the meditator does after gaining facility in the second jhana, he looks into the second jhana, and he sees that even though it's more peaceful than the first jhana, but there's still something. You say that there's still a little troublemaker in the back of the room. What is the little troublemaker in this case?
Rapture.
Right, rapture or piti or joy, because this factor of piti involves some subtle kind of exuberance, or it could spill over into a kind of exuberance or exhilaration, and it becomes like an object of attachment. And so since the meditator has now this map of the stages, He'll know that there is a meditative attainment more peaceful, more excellent than the second jhana, in which rapture vanishes. And that is the third jhana. And so he'll practice aspiring to the third jhana, strengthening his concentration, and when the mental faculties are sufficiently strong, then he moves into the third jhana. And so here we have the formula for the third jhana. The Buddha says, again, with the fading away as well of rapture, Sariputta abided in equanimity and mindful and fully aware, but with clear comprehension. Still feeling pleasure with the body, he entered upon and abided in the third jhana, on account of which the noble ones announce or declare, he has a pleasant feeling, he has a pleasant abiding, who has equanimity and is mindful. Okay, so in terms of the usual sort of standard list of jhana factors, in moving to the third jhana, we've lost vitakka, vichara, and now piti is gone, but we still have sukha, or pleasure, and one-pointedness of mind. But the sutta formula mentions another bunch of factors that become prominent in the third jhana. And so we have here three factors which are now given distinct mention. One of these is equanimity, which we saw is already present in the first and second jhana, but now it's becoming so prominent that it gains mention in its own right. And then the second factor is now mindfulness, again present all through, but now it becomes more prominent. And the third factor is indicated by the word fully aware, and this is, in Pali, this is sampajanya, or the adjective form is sampajano, which the word sampajano comes from, it's related to the word for knowing. The verb that means to know is jhanati, and sam and pa are prefixes which are intended to indicate some aspects of this knowing. So it's, here we could call it like a clear knowing or a clear understanding. But it's not yet the kind of knowing or understanding that comes from panya, what we call wisdom. But this is sort of a clarity, maybe we call it the power of clear observation. And again, this will be a quality which is present all through the process of developing meditation, and in the lower jhanas.